Fantastic. Okay, let me get holding screen up. Okay. Fantastic. Okay, let me get holding screen up. Why can I hear myself? That's not good news. Okay. It's because I have another window open showing the video. Okay, good. Hello, everybody. I know, people are saying in the comments already that I forgot to mute myself. I know, I muted myself too late. So you have a brief commentary at the beginning about how I've got another window open so I can hear myself talking. So hi, again.
Hi.
It wouldn't be Digital Hammurabi without some kind of delightful something, some kind of technological issue. It wouldn't work otherwise. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have the lovely Paul Zimmerman. I nearly called you Steve then, because I've got a Steve talking to me in the chat. You are definitely not a Steve.
No, people used to always mistake my name for Steve when I was in college. It was the oddest thing. I was sure there was a doppelganger at my school.
There's another one of you wandering around somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
No, but we have Paul with us today. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me. If you are new to the channel, my name is Megan Lewis. I run this with my husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen, who is currently making sure our 18-month-old doesn't burst in here and provide some form of comic relief for us all, which, knowing him, would be very loud. And yes, I'm an Assyriologist, and we like to talk to people about history and archaeology, and Paul has very kindly offered to join us today. So I'm going to let Paul do his own introduction. Who you are, where did you come from, how did you get into the field, really anything you want to share.
All right. So I have a PhD in archaeology and anthropology, actually, from the University of Pennsylvania from 2008. It's on work that I did in Yemen, archaeological survey. I also have an MA from the same institution, same department, from 1998 on work that I did looking at Leonard Woolies excavations at Ur, and specifically looking at the architecture from Ur. Mm-hmm. My BA is from a long time ago from the University of Southern California, and it's typical four fields anthropology. So I come at archaeology from the anthropology perspective, the U.S. Tradition, and I am not active in the field, or not directly active. I'm in my 20th year now working in IT at a school in New York City. And it's a school that I first was introduced to because they use archaeology in their curriculum a lot. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they had was a virtual excavation of a site called Tel Barsip, an Assyrian site on the Euphrates. And back in 1998, I was working at the University Museum at Penn in the computer lab, and they were negotiating with Dalton, the school that I work at now, to make a new module of the same program that focused on the things from Ur. So I was brought along as somebody that could speak archaeology and tech.
So it's actually a really useful crossover of skills.
It's been incredibly useful for me. The archaeology never panned out as a career for me, but I still love it. I'm involved in the local AIA chapter. Mm-hmm. I'm still a research associate at Penn. I am co-host of the Archaeotech podcast. I do as much as I can. Mm-hmm. Most of my friends are archaeologists still. I'm still in the world. I just am not gainfully employed in the world.
Me too.
It's tough. It really is. So yeah, then when back in 2000, just as my archaeological career started to go off the rails, my wife became pregnant with our daughter, and I needed a full-time job and something to tide me over for a couple of years. And that couple of years turned into 20. It's been good, though, because we still use archaeology in the curriculum a lot. I was just working with one of our programmers the other day on the latest iteration of that Tilbarsip excavation program. And like I said, I keep involved in the field in a bunch of other ways, not least of which is my wife. She's a curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Met Museum.
Fantastic.
So I'm surrounded
You must
by
be
the world.
absolutely immersed in it.
Yeah. And right now I'm sitting here in the basement of my house in the workroom. You can see a couple laser theodolites back here. I'm working on a program, and so I have a slight addiction to buying old broken laser theodolites and trying to fix them.
Excellent. That is an excellent hobby.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's and one of these days, I'm actually going to find the time to finish that program that I've been writing for years.
One day.
And then maybe get one of these that actually works, and then go back into the field using these.
Oh, that would be fantastic. So that is a wonderful introduction. Thank you. And I should say, before we go any further, audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Tag me at Digital Hammurabi. If you don't tag me, I probably won't see them. And we will try our best to get to them at the end of our discussion. So, Paul, I would really, because I'm actually a little bit of a geek, unsurprisingly, given the field I'm in, and I love the excavations, and the Ore Online project is something that I've spent many happy hours looking through and scrolling through. And for those who don't know, the Ore Online project kind of brings together all of the material that was excavated from the site digitally. So you have all of the excavation reports, all of the objects, where they were found, all of the site maps. It's a fantastic resource. So I really want to talk about ore and what you did in your master's program, if you'd be happy to tell us about that.
So by a little way of background for the listeners, if they don't know, ore was excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was a joint project between the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Iraqi Antiquities Authority. And under the time, they had a system called partage, where the finds would be divided up between the sponsoring institutions and the country of origin, the host country. So basically, the Baghdad Museum has a third of the finds from ore. The British Museum has a third of the finds, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum has a third of the finds. And since I was at school at Penn, I got to look at these, and my advisor and some of my other professors were very deeply involved, and still, decades after the excavation, still looking at and analyzing these materials. So, where do we want to start about
it? So maybe just for those who don't know, early excavations were interesting. Do you want to dive in there?
Yeah, so that project started out in 1922, I believe, and Woolley set a number of test trenches around the top of the tell, and I'm not sure if it was immediately, but very quickly came across one area that was later to be known as the Royal Cemetery. Realized it was very rich in artifacts. Moved to other parts of the tell, particularly around the ziggurat. I mean, if you look at aerial photographs, or you look at satellite photographs of Tel Mulcair, ancient Ur, or the modern name of the site of Ur, rather, it's obvious. It's a huge red building sticking out at the very top of the site. So yeah, he focused a few years of excavating some of the religious structures that were in the vicinity of the ziggurat, and also clearing the ziggurat of the buildup. If you look at photographs and lithographs from the late 19th century, early 20th century, before they got there, it's half covered by sand dunes and other debris. So they focus their efforts on those parts of the site, and then in 1927 or 28, they started working on what became known as the Royal Cemetery. So again, by way of background, in about 1996, we had a seminar at Penn in the art history department. And again, art history and archaeology in our field are like this. We all, it's a slight difference in focus, maybe slight difference in terminology, but all the same materials.
Same material, yeah.
And a lot of the same methods too. There's a lot of crossover. So in the art history department, with Holly Pittman and I can't remember if my advisor Richard Zettler was part of it, but definitely Donald Hansen, who is a prominent archaeologist at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. They were co-teaching a seminar, advanced seminar for the grad students who were studying the ancient Near East, and I was in that, and we all had different projects to do. And I decided, because one of my interests academically is architecture, I decided I was going to look at the tomb architecture. And I started to notice some discrepancies between the stories that Woolley put forth and how I, as an archaeologist, interpreted what he found. And so that became the nucleus of what would be my master's paper.
Fantastic.
And, I say this all the time, but Woolley, he was a master at getting things out of the ground. He's right at a transition period between archaeology of the area being basically, tomb robbing, treasure hunting, and a more scientific approach. So fortunately, he was absolutely anal about the way he worked and took a lot of notes, very good notes and measurements for the time.
Yeah.
The other thing that he was really good at was making stories, right? And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. I mean, he could look at whatever it was that he was excavating and say, here's how I see it, and then paint it in a way that would really capture people's imaginations. And so what I ended up fighting against were some of the stories I thought were wrong based off of the archaeology. And this ties then into what you were just saying about the Ur Online materials. In 1998, my advisor was putting together an exhibition, a traveling exhibition of the finds from Ur, so that they could redo the galleries at Penn. And they and as part of that, he went to the British Museum. He was looking at the archives at Woolley's field notes, and he scanned a bunch of these, and then handed me the scans of the field notes so that so I could use them in my project. Right. And I'm pretty sure on the Ur Online you can see a lot of those field notes.
You can, yeah.
Yeah, they've all been scanned much better now than they were, in the mid '90s. But I went through and I reanalyzed then these materials, and so again, it's the credit to Woolley that he took really good notes, that somebody 70 years later could go back and look at those notes and actually contradict what he had said, which I think is actually a mark of a very fine scholar. The ability to have your ideas falsified by other methods or other knowledge that's learned in the future.
And that's, I think, one of the important things about archaeology as a science is that you can, or you should, when you're carrying out excavation work, take these meticulous notes. And it's obviously come a long way since the 1920s, but you take these meticulous notes and you record absolutely everything that you move. And again, like, Woolley did a fantastic job because they moved a lot of stuff.
Oh, jeez.
That was a huge excavation. Now you get people like opening one, maybe two trenches and just doing that. And I don't want to say he stripped the tell, but he dug a lot.
He dug a lot. In the Royal Cemetery area, they were excavating about 3 graves a day.
Wow.
Which is breakneck speed. And that includes, very simple graves with very few grave goods and no architecture to speak of. But then in the, average it out, it also includes these large tombs. And again, for listeners who might not know, that what's most remarkable about that site, about the Royal Cemetery, it's one part of the tell, near the top of the tell, just at the edge of the sacred precinct, which he called the Temenos, misapplying, I guess, a Greek term for ancient Near Eastern materials. And it was most remarkable because there were 16 tombs that he decided were royal tombs, his name. So they found, I believe, 1,800 some graves in this one part. And but 16 of them he deemed to be royal tombs because they had either standing architecture, evidence of mass burial, multiple burials in the same grave, evidence of sacrifice, human sacrifice in those multiple burials oftentimes, and great grave goods. Lots of gold.
So much gold.
So much gold. A lot of silver too, shell, lapis. I didn't mention it in my intro, I also occasionally adjunct teach a course at Cooper Union here in New York. And just before this last semester started. I wasn't planning on teaching, but I guess something happened and they needed to add a couple extra courses. So somebody that knew me called me up and said, "Oh, could you please teach?" And I love doing that.
Yeah.
So now I'm teaching an art and architecture survey course, art and architecture of the ancient Near East.
Yeah.
And next week I'm going to be starting in on the Royal Cemetery. So I'm starting to fill it in. For me, it's the best way to draw examples to earlier and later things in ancient Near Eastern art. I mean, there are a lot of things that shift and change, but there are also certain threads, certain motifs that we can see that persist across thousands of years. And so the Royal Cemetery is a great introduction to that because it's encapsulated in time. It's only a few hundred years that we're looking at, and if you just want to look at it for the aesthetics of it, it catches your eye. There's a lot of really pretty stuff that comes out of that.
It really is. And then if people aren't so interested in the aesthetics, you mentioned human sacrifice, and I assume every head in the room turns.
Human sacrifice. Yeah. So there are a few tombs that are better known than others, and the one belongs to Queen Puabi, or Lady Puabi, Puabi Nin. She was. We don't actually know who she was. We don't know who she was the queen to. We don't know exactly what her role was there, but she was found in a tomb with a couple attendants buried inside with her, and all sorts of grave goods piled probably on shelves around the inside of this tomb. The tomb itself was built out of a combination of stone and earth, kind of tamped together, so like concrete. Woolley thought that it was actually poured like concrete because he thought he saw evidence of boards that would have. So if you've ever seen a poured concrete foundations for a building, they set up plywood boards and they pour the concrete in between, then pull the boards away. He thought he saw evidence of something like that. And then it had a mud brick, not fully domed. It was an arched with kind of apsidal ends roof. And outside of that tomb chamber, there was another area, an area he calls these ones death pits, again, with lots of human bodies in it and lots of very elaborate grave goods and some animals that were buried there, some draft animals. I'll get back to Puabi because that's the part that if anybody's going to remember me 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it'll be about what I unpacked about this story. But another one that people may have heard of is another one of these graves. It doesn't actually have any standing architecture in it, but it has, I should have looked up before. I think it's 73 bodies in this one grave. Mostly women, maybe entirely women, dressed up in with gold headdresses, with gold bands, with jewelry, with a number of musical instruments, and not just plain simple music, but very large lyres, including one called the Great Lyre. So this death pit he called the Great Death Pit. It's tomb PG 1237, and the PGs, each tomb is named PG, private grave, and then a sequential number. So PG 800 is where Puabi came from. It was the 800th, and it's closely related, and we can get to that, to 789. They're right next to each other. And 1237 was found the following year. 800 and 789 were excavated in the 28 to 29 field season, and 1237 was in the following season, 29 to 30. Lots of burials. A couple of them were saved. A couple skulls were saved with because of the headdresses that were on them. So one of them was believed to be male because he's got a helmet and he was found in the ramp that leads down to the death pit area. And another one is one of the female attendants from 1237 from the Great Death Pit. These two skulls were brought to Penn and have been on display there. They're on display again. At the same time that I was studying the architecture, another grad student, Abru Badsgard, was looking with the help of Janet Monch, who's a forensic anthropologist at Penn. They were looking at the bones and trying to figure out the treatment.
I was going to ask if you were there when that was going on.
Yeah. I feel badly speaking about somebody else's research here, but in a nutshell, what they found is that it looked like these bones were treated. There was a lot of in Woolies Reconstructions, and you can see this. He was very good at making stories, and the stories captivated people's imagination. So as they were excavating, he'd send cables back home, and immediately upon getting back from the field, he'd write up popular books that were very popular. This is the late 20s. It's only a few years removed from the discovery of King Tut's tomb, and so archaeology of the Middle East, the Near East, however we want to call it, is very much in people's minds, both in Europe and the U.S. And so he sold a lot of these books. They would have regular features in magazines, in the London Illustrated News. So you can find great reconstructions. There's one reconstruction that shows one of the tombs with everybody in it playing their instruments, and another one with everybody collapsed dead. A lot of the bodies were found with cups, and so the supposition was that those were filled with poison. People drank the poison, dropped dead there. What Aubrey and Janet found was that it didn't look like, at least in the case of the bodies that they looked at, that was actually what happened. It looked like these bodies were killed by a blow to the back of the head with a sharp, blunt object, and then treated by some drying with heat, and also possibly treated with cinnabar, which has mercury, which serves as a preservative.
So a rudimentary embalming process to
delay the decomposition, so that what basically they had is, we still don't know who these people were. Were they slaves? Were they captured enemies? Were they initiates in the cult? We don't really know. But what we are pretty sure of now is that rather than going there and participating in a funerary feast that resulted in their death, so they could follow their the queen, for example, to the afterlife, they were people who were killed and treated and then dressed up as if they were in this this party, this funerary party, which is interesting because that undoes a lot of supposition of how these people were treated, why they ended up in those tombs. That we'd been kind of mulling for the previous 70 years before that study came out.
And that's, for me, that's one of the most striking examples of how you can revisit past excavations and material that has been out of the ground for several decades, how you can come back to it with new technology and new methods and advance our understanding of actually what it is we're looking at here.
Right. And so then I can jump into my
Please
own little bit. So like I said, I was finding discrepancies in between what Woolley said the architecture and the archaeology looked like and what I, as an archaeologist, saw when I read the field notes. And it started actually when Donald Hanson, in that seminar, one of the students was showing the ceramics that came from one of these tombs. And this particular one, I think it was 1050 or 1054, had multiple phases vertically of different sets of architecture. Now, in Woolley's description, they had, in antiquity, they'd sunk a shaft, they built a tomb down at the bottom of it, they had their ritual, then they partially filled it in, built another building, but it was all basically one funerary event. As that other student got to some of the upper levels, she showed some of the vessels that had come out of the upper levels, and Donald Hanson looked at it and said, boom! And if anybody knows him, that's exactly what he sounds like. Those are Akkadian. So they weren't early dynastic like Woolley had argued, but in Dr. Hanson's view, were absolutely, positively, unambiguously Akkadian in time period.
Much later than the original early dynastic.
Much later, yeah, a couple hundred years later then. So that got me thinking that, why did Woolley think that all these things, just because they were in the same shaft, were actually of the same event, were related temporally and related as one distinct funerary event? Wooley, remember, there's 1,800 burials, 1,800 plus that they excavated and numbered, PG 1, 2, 3 on down. He estimated that there were at least 3 times as many burials in that same area that they just weren't able to completely recover. Yeah, so many people buried there for so long. So I thought, well, what makes the shaft? What did Wooley actually notice that was different between the soil that was there, that was the natural part of the tell, and where in antiquity they dug down through and then filled back in? And so if you have a pit, you can often see the difference between the surrounding matrix and the fill of the pit. But I didn't find any good evidence for that. I didn't find photographs. I didn't find anything in the notes. It seemed to me like it was a convenience on Wooley's part, that they dug down and they're going very quickly. And he said, "Oh, this and this, they're directly one above the other, therefore they're the same."
Yeah.
And then that kind of started unraveling how I saw a lot of what Wooley said about the sequence of events in the Royal Cemetery. Again, my interest was architecture, so I decided that I wanted to do a typology of the royal tombs to see if I could break them down into construction techniques, size, footprint, presence or absence of a death pit next to them, and then see if maybe if I could then tease it out and make a sequence, a stylistic sequence of these 16 tombs. And in doing that, close reading of 789 Queen Puabi's tomb, and 800 Queen Puabi's tomb, and 789, which was in Wooley's story the king's tomb. Okay, these 2 tomb chambers are side by side, actually like that, in the ground. They're at about the same level depth and about the same height, and they're constructed nearly identically. So in this case, it's very likely that whoever was buried in them wanted to be buried next to each other. That's part of Wooley's story. I fully agree with that. Wooley's story was the king died and his tomb was sunk, and they had in the tomb chamber the king and some attendants and a lot of grave goods. And then out in the death pit, they had a large number again of attendants, of soldiers on the ramp down in, of female singers and of pack animals and such. And then some short time later, his queen, Puabi, died. And so they sunk her tomb chamber down to the same level and built one right next, so she could be right next to her king. But the logical place then to put her death pit would have been right where his death pit was. And that wouldn't have been possible because there's already a tomb chamber there. Well, there's a death pit there, but they've already filled in. So he decided that what happened was that they made her death pit up here over his tomb, and again filled with soldiers and female attendants and pack animals and musical instruments and all that great stuff. And that was a story that persisted for 70 years. King dies, queen dies. She wants to be buried next to him. She's buried next to him, but they can't put her death pit where it should be, so they put it the closest possible place. A couple little wrinkles to that. One is that the 789, the king's tomb chamber, was mostly emptied in antiquity. In antiquity, some of the bricks had been removed out of that vaulted roof, and the contents of that tomb chamber were emptied out. And then, in this part, I think Wooley also has right, whoever did that tried to hide that theft by putting a large wardrobe box directly over the hole in the roof down below in that upper death pit. So we don't actually have. Sorry, there's a little drama going on upstairs. We don't actually have the body of the king. It's based off of, that's a king is based off of the supposition that Puabi is a queen, therefore there has to be a king next door, right? And the find of maybe, I'm trying to remember, I think a silver knife that was not removed. And that highlights another thing. These bodies weren't sexed at the time. So gender is assigned to them based off of the grave goods. right? So if you've got a spear and you've got a helmet, you're male. If you've got, gold in your hair, you must be a woman. The quality of the preservation of the bones is really bad. Right. I'd be very curious, and I should talk to Janet about it, whether they'd be able to extract DNA from those bones, and then we'd know for certain the sex, and see if that matches what we perceived of as the gender of them. And so anyhow, but we don't know that the king was actually a king. We don't even know that there was a male primary internment in that. So the problems I started to find is that Woolley came up with this idea about the sequence of these in the field as he was digging. It wasn't something that he sat back and mulled over his notes for months. He, within about a week of finding these two burials, decided that they were related, and he came up with the sequence of events. He had the story. But what I noticed was that the connection between that upper death pit, the one that belongs to Puabi, and that tomb chamber that belongs to Puabi, is really tenuous. They're in the photographs, and also in the top plan that's published, and in the notes. They never get more than about half a meter from each other. There is no actual direct connection of one to the other, and you can see all the objects in that uppermost tomb chamber, death pit, excuse me, kind of go up to the edges, but they stop. Mm-hmm. And then there's a gap before we get to the edge of where her tomb chamber is. Mm-hmm. So there's not a real strong direct connection between these. So assuming that death pit belonged to that tomb chamber is a supposition on his part. Other thing that I noticed was that the floor of Puabi's tomb chamber is about 40 centimeters lower than the floor of the so-called King's tomb chamber.
Okay.
I see that, and I think that, yes, these two are deliberately put next to each other, but I see it as hers being...
She was there first.
Yes, before his. And his. Okay, fine. So why didn't they find her grave goods, her death pit? That's the word I'm looking for. He never actually went through the floor of the 789 tomb chamber or death pit. He stopped digging there. So had he gone down another half meter, I'm pretty sure he would have run into hers. But he had decided that the sequence was the other way around, and therefore he didn't have any reason to go down.
Yeah, no need to, because it fits.
It fits, right? So, and then, that in conjunction with a bunch of the other things, like what I just said about Dr. Hansen screaming out that, oh, it's Acadian! Really led me to question the stories that Woolley put together about how things happen sequentially, about the stratigraphy of the site, looking at very stratigraphically. I did actually pull apart and come up with my own seriation of the tomb chambers. And I did that, again, being a techie. I took all the measurements and I made 3D models of all the buildings. And so on the one hand, I have the formal analysis. It's got stone walls, it's got mud brick walls, it's got and on the other hand, I took these, and to the best of my ability, I placed them in a 3D model in space.
Fantastic.
And it's very complicated stratigraphy because it's it's very the Royal Cemetery cuts through an area called the seal impression strata. It's right at the edge of the temenos, and it's sloped like that. The strata go down like this, and hundreds of years of stratigraphy that goes like this with things cut through it horizontally. So I know that I wouldn't be able to dig that properly, and I can guarantee you that Woolley didn't dig that carefully stratigraphically at the pace he was going in the 1920s. It just wouldn't have happened.
No.
So I tried my best to, where we did have measurements of a couple different strata that went through. I used that to extrapolate what the ancient surface of the tell would have been like, and use that then as another point of evidence alongside that formal analysis of the architecture. to try to come up with a seriation, which ones are earlier, which ones are later. And I think that part held, but that's not the part anybody cares about. Anybody cares about this cares about it because the inversion of Puabi and her king, which is fine with me. In '98, when I first wrote that, my advisor was he believed me, and he proposed that to a number of his colleagues, and he got a lot of maybes. And over the last 20 years, it's gone from that to basically being accepted.
This is what happened.
It's probably more likely to have been the other way around. Puabi first, and then whoever was buried in 789 afterwards. And also that, not calling it the queen and her king, or the king and his queen, but the queen and somebody else.
A person, probably.
Yeah, a person, probably pretty important, seeing that they had that that tomb chamber, that death pit right there with all those other people.
Okay, good. We are.
No, I heard you all along. I hope.
No, when I copy and paste questions from the audience so I can keep track of them. So I mute myself when I do that, so you don't have my keyboards clicking. And someone just put in the chat, "No sound?" ? And I was like, "Oh my god, did I accidentally mute us both?" But I have little audio spikes when we talk, so I think we're good.
Oh, okay. You're still able to hear me, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'm just not sure if I'm projecting properly. I normally, if I use this microphone, I'm usually up close when I podcast, and now it's a foot and a half from me.
No, you're very clear.
Okay, good.
No, that's really cool, and and having looked at, for myself, having spent time looking at the Ore Online project, and so my PhD dissertation before I put it on hold was looking at royal inscriptions, and I spent, one of my chapters actually was going through all of the inscribed objects from ore and from the death pits and the tombs, and matching the inscriptions and the objects and the find spots, and trying to make sense of all that. And going back to old excavation reports is quite singularly frustrating, because you can't ask for more information other than what is written there. So that you were able to put all of that together and come up with conclusions and move the field forward, I think is quite extraordinary.
Well, move the field forward incrementally.
Well, I mean, that's how it works, though.
It's fun, and if that's what I go to my grave as my high point, that's fine. I'm okay with it. Yeah, it's really tough. Actually, Donald Hanson was an art historian, but also an excellent excavator. One of the tops. Did the sounding at Nippur that gives us a lot of the sequence of the early dynastic. Excavated the temple of Inanna at Nippur. Excavated Al-Hibba, identifying as Lagash. Prior to those excavations, Tello was thought to be Lagash. So very important figure in our field. He used to take his art history students to the field on purpose, for the one reason that way, once they've excavated some mud brick and knew exactly how hard it was to do, they would know to read anybody's field reports with a lot of skepticism, because it's so easy to make things up when you're digging mud brick. It just, it takes a great skill, but then the complication of it is that, mud brick buildings in antiquity and in the current day, where they're still used, where it's still used as building material, is really conducive to modifications and changes and slow kind of degradation by the elements that gets repaired or not, depending on the whims of the owners or the users of the structure. And then the fundamental problem is that tells are built up of the detritus of humans living in one spot for a long time. Most of that accumulation is degraded mud brick. So you're trying to get mud brick out of a tell, out of a matrix that is made up mostly of decayed mud brick.
Old mud brick, right?
Right, and if you're lucky, you get a couple courses at the bottom of a wall. And it may have been chopped up and dinged up, and you've got intrusions and all the other things that you have when you're digging anywhere. But it's extremely difficult to dig it well. I've never gotten good at it. I haven't been in the field for a long time either. So, maybe there's still hope for me, but he used to, yeah, Hansen used to take his students out so that they knew exactly how tough it was, and then to always, question what they read in the site reports.
That's an excellent lesson to have, actually.
Yeah.
And I haven't excavated properly. I did one season at this is very embarrassing. It's my only season of archaeological work, and I cannot remember the site.
Where was it?
It's southern Turkey. It's next to Alalak.
Oh, I worked there. I worked on Tel Kurdu, which is right next to Alalak.
Yeah,
you worked at
Tynut. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, I sincerely hope no one that I was there with is watching. The chance of them watching is very minimal. No, it was a fantastic site, but I did a summer of site survey, which, for, again, those who don't know, is mainly combing through cornfields and cotton fields trying to find tiny sherds of pottery, which gave me a very healthy dose of respect for anyone who chooses archaeology as a profession. Because quite apart from it being hard work physically, coming away with all of that massive information and trying to make sense of it is...
It's daunting.
It is. And I think you obviously have to have a very specific skill set, but I think you also have to be very, very tenacious. So, archaeologists of the world, I thank you as an Assyriologist who will never, ever go on excavation again.
Well, I always tell my students is, I started saying that art history and archaeology are like this. The epigraphers and the archaeologists and the art histories, we all work in the same field. What you guys have is such a specialized set of tools and knowledge and such that it's really hard for us to dip into your world, but you dip into ours all the time. No. And that's not okay. No, that's totally great. That's totally fine. I'm saying that's not a problem. It's asymmetric, whereas it's much more symmetrical between art history and archaeology. It's less symmetric between either of those fields and epigraphy, though. All the materials that you're looking at ultimately are archaeological materials.
Products of archaeologists,
yeah. So, it's all still one happy family, like the usual stuff that happy families have.
And we'll leave it there. So we have a couple of questions. So yes. I will get to those now. If you have, audience, more questions, pop them in the chat now, because we'll probably go another 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll all go and get on with our respective Saturdays. The first question is actually one that was asked last, but I think it's the most pertinent to what we just spoke about. Has anyone done any sonar analysis under the death pit that was originally attributed to Puabi?
No, there's a project. Again, Penn has the permit to work in that part of the site, and Brad Hafford from Penn has been there a couple of times doing some pedestrian survey and some excavations on other parts of the site. I'm trying to remember who he was working with. I want to say Elizabeth Stone, but I'm not certain. So there's an inclination to actually start doing some more test pits in the area, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been any sort of non-intrusive subsurface work.
Excellent. Thank you.
There should be. It'd be great.
It would be, interesting to see.
Though I do have to wonder, the Royal Cemetery area was dug out in the 1920s, and basically that's just a depression now, and it's had, most of a century of sun and water. And so I can tell you that if a site's been partially cleared out like that, and filled up then with water and turned to mud, and that can be really hard to get through. And I wouldn't be surprised even if we did bring sonar, resistivity, GPR, whatever kind of subsurface techniques we wanted to, that we wouldn't see anything, because I think it would just be a very compact and hard matrix.
Area, right. Lovely, thank you. So we have two questions from the lovely Steve Bowden, who is always very enthusiastic about the live streams. A similar question. So I know that for police forensics, you can get a laser scan to directly measure the features in a room. Is there anything similar for people doing an archaeological dig?
Kind of. I don't know what people are using currently. Everything that I see looks very much like what we were doing 20 plus years ago. At Penn, we had two different projects. We were kind of in competition. One was in Harold Dibble's paleoanthropology lab, and the other was in MASCA, which is where I was. That was the Museum Applied Science Center for Archaeology in the museum, where we had developed our own software for driving total stations. And in the late 90s, kind of on the cusp of the first .com boom and bust, we were looking at turning our software into a more commercial product. And one of the things that we were thinking of doing was advertising it for, was trying to sell it to police departments and for forensic investigations, because we figured that you could use it if you had, gunshots, you could use it to trace out the trajectories of gunshots and so on. So I know the technology's there. I know that people can use it, and I do intend to go back in the field once I get some time and these things working properly, and do something like that. But I'm not certain that anybody currently is. And if anybody is, and I haven't mentioned, I can't think of it right now. Yeah. Please let me know, because I'm very embarrassed that I don't know the answer. But I really have not seen anything that seems to me like it's as comprehensive as what Steve just asked, about the measurements of a room. We do it to get a point or a line and extrapolate from that, but not like a scan of the entire room. There are projects that do that for heritage preservation. Google's been doing that. Microsoft's been doing that. There's a company called SciArc that's been doing that. And that's a whole nother thing. And that's been mostly focused on standing architecture and of very famous monuments, things like the Ishtar Gate at Babylon.
There's also, and again, I don't think for interior features, but LiDAR. You obviously are going to know far more about LiDAR than I am, but it's I remember reading a report they did in South America to find, and I'm sure you've read the same one, to find archaeological features underneath the tree canopies.
Right. So that's work that's being done mostly out of Tulane, and they're using LiDAR from airplanes, from small planes, and they're measuring it through the canopy in Guatemala. And so there've been a couple the last year and the year before. There've been a few news press releases and caught some interest. That actually is from one of the principals on that project is Marcello Canuto. He was a year or two ahead of me at Penn when we were there, so I know him. And he actually went to school with my wife when they were kids. So we know them from forever. I keep on trying to get him onto my podcast because I want him to discuss that, but I haven't been able to yet. But yeah, so LiDAR is being used increasingly for that. It's been not just for looking through the canopy. That's where it's been really remarkable, is that what it does is it throws down thousands of laser pulses, and a few of those make their way through all the leaves and hit the ground and return. And so it's the accumulation of thousands and thousands and thousands of points of data. And then when they run them through the software, they can see the canopy where most of them are bouncing off of, but then they see another layer down here, and those are the ground features. And so they've been using them for that, but it's also been used in much easier to survey sites, British hill forts and all sorts of stuff, where it gets flown around and there isn't any overgrown canopy to go through, but it allows them to build 3D models very accurately and very quickly. I don't know about anybody using LiDAR inside, but again, I'd be shocked if architectural historians haven't been doing that. It's outside of my field.
No, thank you. Another one from Steve. So if humans were sacrificed as part of funerals, is there any evidence for mass poisoning when the defeat of a city was imminent?
That would be a question for you, not for me.
It would. So the human sacrifice that you see at the city of Ur is, as far as I'm aware, one of the only instances we have from Mesopotamia. It is not at all a common practice, and it's been theorized that this particular instance is linked to the formation of royal ideology and really the beginning of kingship. And the rise of the city-state, and once there's an established monarchy, once the power structure is in place, it just doesn't happen anymore. And I've never heard of any kind of mass poisoning event. Certainly not in Mesopotamia. You obviously get destruction layers are unfortunately an archaeologist's absolute dream, because you get all of this stuff just preserved. People, when they're running, don't like take their documents, they don't take their records, they go. So if your city is being attacked and you leave, there's a lot of material left behind for us to excavate and examine. But no mass like poisonings, no large amounts of dead people that are dead for reasons other than someone stabbed them. So yes,
Yeah,
no, not that I know of. And we have one final question from Raphael Block. It sounds like now there is archaeology of previous archaeologists, new techniques versus old techniques, uncovering what's been covered. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty good way of summing it up, I think.
That's actually a big trend in archaeology, quite frequently amongst American archaeologists who are working with materials that are potentially related to descendant cultures, so Native American groups in particular, where archaeologists are constantly saying, you know, why am I having my grad student go dig a new site when we have thousands of objects and notes and such materials that need to be processed that are already sitting in storage? Archaeology is inherently destructive, and especially in the case of if you have descendant communities, it may be, you know, politically tendentious. It might upset somebody. Why are we going to do this rather than study the materials that we already have? So there's a big new growing trend of, rather than go out and do a new archaeological project, mm-hmm. excavate our old archaeological projects. And then side by side with that, a lot of archaeological projects, and this isn't brand new, but for a while have actually deliberately excavated the places where some of these big digs from the late 19th, early 20th century happened, trying to find out, you know, the exact dimensions of the trenches that were sunk back then, mm-hmm. for example, and see if, you know, clean up and understand the stratigraphy because it wasn't recorded back then. You know, so there are at least those two distinct mm-hmm. ways that archaeologists are re-examining materials of previous archaeologists. Mm-hmm.
It's also, this is a quite pedestrian comment, it's also a lot cheaper. Opening a new archaeological excavation is incredibly expensive. If you have the material in your university museum, or if it's freely available online, then you don't have to pay diggers, you don't have to pay site security, any of the permits. Yeah.
Travel to the country, food,
yes.
transportation in country.
All of that
costs rack up really quickly on a big project.
So we have one final question, Josephus Rivero. I think I heard you mention something called the Ore Online project. Is that something that is available to the public? Yes, it is. It's fantastic. The website, I just looked it up, is www.ore-online.org. It's very easy to use. There's a fantastic search function. Just go explore it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's a place that you can go and lose many hours if you're somebody that's inclined to go down a rabbit hole.
So many hours. And my favorite feature is you can, like, if you look hard enough, you can select an individual room in one of the temples and just scroll through and look at all of the objects that were found in that room, which is absolutely fascinating for me, because especially, and again, this is my dissertation, looking at royal inscriptions, something that is very rarely information that is rarely presented to you when you're looking at inscriptional evidence is, what was this object found with? Right. Where was it found? What was it doing? What was it with? And it's very interesting to be able to go and actually look at that information. We are out of questions. So Paul, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating.
Well, a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased that we did this.
No, me too. Audience, thank you. As ever, your questions were wonderful. And yeah, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?